Welcome to Ideology. I'm here with Drew Stedman, Mick Murray with A.J. Cooley, and we've had a good time laughing before the episode started, so we're trying to collect ourselves to talk about James K.A. Smith's book, How Not to Be Secular.
And this is a good moment to say, if you don't follow us on Instagram, you're going to be missing out on an incredible story that you're going to want to hear. That probably is not appropriate for the podcast episode, but I think you're going to like.
We could weave it in somehow.
I actually think we could.
Okay.
Without ruining this episode, but you're going to want to hear it.
That's fair. If for some reason you're just now stumbling on this podcast, we are in a book review series on the book How Not to Be Secular. And this would be, week 3? We did kind of a setup, and then last week we looked at chapter 1. And now we're diving into chapters 2 and 3. And I'll say, I know, Drew, you've read all the way to the end of the book. I am just kind of following along with the podcast. I've only read through chapters 2 and 3. And it was a great read in preparation for this podcast. I really appreciate the summary of Charles Taylor's work, A Secular Age. And without further ado, let's just dive right in.
Yeah. So, Mick, I saw here your notes, the linear subtraction versus zigzag, or pretty early on in that chapter. I'd love to hear your take on what'd you draw from that?
Yeah, I only put that on there because we were going to talk about that at the end of the last episode, and wanted to make sure we touched on that because I thought that was a great point that he made. But just when he talks about the progress of arriving at what is believable in terms of the secular age in which we live, that at least what I took from the idea of zigzag was it was not a linear process. Mm-hmm. This was not an inevitable process, that there were kind of like predicting the weather. There were forces, so many, like the sum of so many forces that created this web of causality that no one could have predicted and really is hard to even untangle in retrospect. And then linear subtraction. What did you take? I can't remember exactly the point behind linear subtraction, but I know that idea of subtraction is that it was not this process of stripping back superstition until we arrive at kind of this baseline neutral set of beliefs about the world that's largely predicated on materialism or naturalism. It's not this subtraction theory that secularism is kind of the core of belief that other beliefs are based upon. Is that more or less what you understood him to mean by linear subtraction?
Yeah, the subtraction theories are, this idea that you strip away religious belief or superstition or whatever other things, and you land, like you said, Mick, on these. I don't want to use the word beliefs because that's not how somebody who would uphold a subtraction theory would talk. But you land on these things that are human reason. Anytime we're talking about universals, maybe that could be a good way of looking at it. So what's happening is you're subtracting off these cultural things and trying to boil it down to these universal human nature, scientific foundations for a belief system. And so if you buy into a subtraction theory, what you tend to do is you view the world through the lens of progress. So we are moving on this linear line, and it's almost inevitable that we are where we are because with time, with human advancement, we have understood more about the world, and it's just a matter of time until we kind of land on this secular, maybe not one world secular culture, but this what all good smart people think description of the world, and we're just peeling back layers of cultural products that have hindered the development or aided the development. There's charitable and less than charitable ways that a subtraction theory could be advanced. You could view various religious developments over the time as necessary steps that did good in their time, but now they're being peeled back because we don't need them anymore. Or you could view them as hindrances to human advancement, and it's good that they're being driven away. But either way, those are both a subtraction theory. Mm-hmm. Now, the irony is that that's very difficult to sustain with secular, or other forms of philosophy these days. And most of what we know about human culture, about human knowledge, about human language is the reality that that's actually not how things are. There aren't universals like that. Instead, all of life is cultural products. And I don't know that you could get away with a subtraction theory as an argument in a philosophy class. It'd be very difficult to do that. And what this underscores for me is the power of narrative. It's not that there's somebody out there in a university system teaching a subtraction theory. You're not going to find subtraction theory course. Instead, it's a default narrative that a lot of people haven't questioned. So their understanding is the world was trapped in, religion and superstition. Then we had this period of enlightenment, and now we're in this slow process of moving into this naturalistic telos of humanism and human reason. And it's inevitably moving towards that, and it's just a matter of time till the world becomes secular. It's not that somebody, I couldn't think that I'm going to go find a modern dissertation published about that, for example. But it's so baked into culture that a lot of people's perspective on the Middle Ages, for example, or things like that, there's this background storyline that's this subtraction theory that then does bleed over into academic work or other things, art, things like that, because we've internalized a story. Even if, a potential adherent, if they sat down and logically thought it through, they'd recognize that story is pretty incoherent with our understanding of the world. So that's all what Taylor's getting into with this, is yes, this is a story that's out there, but that story doesn't even quite make sense. And what I appreciate about him is he's not writing this as a Christian apologetic. Now, some of the reviews, it's obvious that he is Christian, and he's not trying to hide the fact that he's a Catholic writing this story, but he's first and foremost, I would say, writing as a philosopher. And so I know we've had even some engagement with people who aren't Christian with this topic, which I think was wonderful. And regardless of where you are on the line of faith, I think you can appreciate what Taylor's doing here. And to take his approach, say, does it make sense to the world as you know it, even if you're coming from a different belief system? He's really arguing not just as a Christian, but he's arguing as a philosopher. And I think he makes some really great points.
Yeah, that's a good segue to chapter 2. And I know you highlighted, I also highlighted at the beginning of the second paragraph, this is a great quote. I just want to read it in full because I feel like this really underscores a main theme of this podcast, which is contrasting secularism not as, again, this reductionistic, subtractive end point or beginning point, but actually as a set of beliefs that kind of set over and against Christianity is based on as many assumptions, if not more. It's truly a faith system. I was actually just meeting with a group of 12-year-olds this morning, a little boys' discipleship group with one of my sons, and we were talking about that atheism actually, when you kind of boil it down, is just as much predicated on faith. Like if you really look at the claims of not just science, but scientism that tries to explain away the universe and what preceded it and so on and so forth. So this quote, he says, "It's not enough to ask how we got permission to stop believing in God. We need to also inquire about what emerged to replace such belief, because it's not that our secular age is an age of disbelief, it's an age of believing otherwise."
And that really hits the concept that secularism is a religion or a belief system. And I'll use that. I know if I use the word religion, that's maybe a bit more controversial, but belief system, it's believing otherwise is the core. He goes on to quote, on the subtraction story account, modern exclusive humanism is just the natural telos of human life. And so, that's what we were talking about earlier is it's not that that's just naturally where we're all going to end up. Instead, it's an active belief system where the possibility of believing otherwise has been created for us so that we can now imagine the world differently than was previously possible within a more, what's the right word to just say this, a more defined religious framework. I don't think it's any less religious in its framework, but it's not defined. So that obviously has been a significant thought for me over the years, you as well, Mick, of looking at the world and asking for honesty. I find it a lot easier with somebody if I'm having a conversation with them, if they can own the fact that they also operate within a belief system. But sometimes in argumentation, or not even argument, but if we're just talking through something, a lot of what we seed without thinking about it is interesting to me in the way that conversations flow. And so if I establish that secularism is neutral, then the rest of what I'm doing is I am having to demonstrate how my active belief system corresponds to a supposedly neutral belief system. But if from the very get-go we can have the acknowledgement that all of us operate within a belief system, none of our belief systems are universal or based upon some type of established epistemology or something else like that. All of our belief systems have significantly interacted with human culture and to some extent are the product of human culture, that levels the playing field then where it's really more of a correspondence conversation where I have curiosity to understand what your belief system is, but I also don't feel intimidated that I have my own belief system. And I think that's the right way, if I could say it this way, to do interreligious dialogue between those of us who uphold the traditional Christian faith and those who are adherents of secularism, is I don't feel the obligation that I have to somehow demonstrate how my faith fits under somebody else's secularism. I want to have the freedom to think out my faith on its own terms, just like a secular person, whether they would admit they're atheist or whether they would have some other type of spiritual way of understanding their secularism, should have the freedom to do the same thing. And that's exactly what I would do if I was international talking with a Muslim, is we own the fact that we all live within a belief system.
Yep. And that then segues to, he talks about this fourfold process of immanentization. It's a bit of a mouthful, but that idea, when you contrast immanency with transcendence, that the transcendent is outside of our experience and stands over and above our experience and is of a categorically different nature than us, namely God in the Judeo-Christian framework, God in the realm of God. This process of immanentization has shrunk reality down to just the natural order. And he talks about a fourfold process. And the first part of that, he talks about the eclipse of further purpose, which I thought was a really interesting analysis of even Christianity's contribution to that process, unwittingly. And actually, many of these steps in this march towards secularism, with humanity's inability at times to hold things in tension, Christians have unwittingly contributed to this process. But this eclipse of further purpose, he's talking about how the church or humans kind of shifted our telos, our purpose for existence, from pleasing God or the gods to a more of an immanent purpose, that the purpose of God, let's just say within the realm of the church, the realm of Christians, that the purpose of God is for the betterment of the human condition or for a flourishing human society in equilibrium with the created order, or however you would say it. But there was this shift of, I am more preoccupied with how I am thinking about eternity and the life beyond and the will of God, and then appropriating the will of God to the betterment of my station and my situation or the human condition.
There's a critique that has been leveled, especially against scholastic or medieval Christianity, where an argument you'll hear at times is you had these scholars arguing about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. And the point of that is this argument that has no bearing on the human condition. So there are people starving to death because our farming techniques aren't accurate, or the monasteries own all the land and are complicit with these feudal lords, and the scholars of the church are arguing about angels dancing on the head of a pin. That idea is one of the main critiques of medieval Christianity, and you still find it a lot today. We're too heavenly minded to do any kind of earthly good. So what a lot of Christians have done, and this is this first point you're saying here, Mick, is we have probably rightfully recognized that the message of God and the message of grace is meant to bring about change in this world. And you can't escape that in Scripture. God clearly has a deep concern for the poor, for the social condition, for those who are marginalized and outcast, the betterment of humanity. So that's obviously a concern of Scripture. But I appreciate what Smith, on page 49, if you're reading along with us, he asked the question, are we swinging too far against dualism? And so have we taken that critique and internalized it to such an extent that in our effort to demonstrate how God wants to bring about change in the here and now, that we've swung too far the other way and actually lost sight of eternity? And what both Taylor and Smith are calling our attention to is there's something about the Christian faith where it's transcendence and immanence. Or if those words are new to you, and I know sometimes you're having to learn a new language. Whenever I read the word immanent, it's this idea of my attention is on what can be known and experienced in this world. Doesn't mean there is nothing beyond this world, but if I was going to have a fully immanent view, I would limit my understanding of knowledge or life to just what I experience in this world. And whatever is beyond, I just admit I can't know it. That's obviously not something that a Christian would uphold. Transcendence is God and His glory that is beyond my knowledge or ability to know in this world, or it's the future of God in eternity. It's those sorts of things. And so picture a pendulum. We're swinging from one end to the other. And you mentioned equilibrium. Rather than living in the equilibrium of there needs to be something about eternity that lifts my gaze upward and motivates me, that there's more to this life. And I need to recognize what's right there in the prayer, the Lord's Prayer, may your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. If you lose heaven or earth in the prayer, something is missed in the Christian faith.
Yeah, and that leads kind of neatly to the next two points of his fourfold process. The second being an eclipse of grace, and the quote here being, God's providential concern for order is reduced to an economic ordering of creation to our mutual benefit. He talks about how if this ordering of kind of the economy, if you will, not just money, but the economy of the world for our benefit, if that's discernible by human reason, then God's agency is no longer necessary to bring that result about. And so you have this kind of eclipsing of the need for God's activity in the world, which leads to what he calls more or less a functional deism, which then leads to the third step in the process, which is a fading sense of mystery. And God is reduced to, again, kind of the clockmaker who created the world, set it in motion, but has kind of stood back, and now humans have everything that we need in order to bring about an advantageous end to the human condition within our own power.
And that really takes to his fourth, is that we lose the idea that God is planning, and I'm quoting him directly here, God is planning a transformation of human beings which would take them beyond the limitations which inhere in their present condition. And so, in other words, we see the scope of this life being what we can control and handle. And so we might take knowledge that comes via revelation or the Christian tradition, or we might take the ethical example of Jesus, or something like that, and we apply it to our life. But we're not envisioning that I'm being filled with the power of the Holy Spirit through the grace of God, being transformed into his likeness, and fundamentally a new creation that is expressing the kingdom of God on this earth through the power of God and unto Christ's eternal reign. That gets lost. And so the scope of our vision is limited to this world. And, on page 51, he summarizes this, where he has this concept that I think is a significant one, is that in our response, in a lot of historic Christian response to these shifts that have taken place in the surrounding culture, we concede the points. And so what we end up doing is we reduce God to fit. Like we want to demonstrate, or maybe another way of saying this is, I want to prove the relevance of my faith to a culture that believes those four things. And so therefore I water down my faith because I don't want to have to deal with the things that conflict in some way. And this maybe is more relevant to a previous generation of Christian response to modernity. I think the same dynamic is happening today, but in ethics, not as much in metaphysics. But it definitely has been a part of Christian response. And a lot of, maybe 1850s to 1950s liberal Protestant theology, that's exactly what they were trying to do, is they were basically ceding the point about those things. And so then what they were demonstrating is the ethical example of Christianity and its benefit to a secular culture. And I think that was the peak of, both in England, the United States, Germany, you would have theologians who, they were really seen as a moral voice to the society, which there's something cool about that. But the downside of what was happening is they were seeding all this stuff. And so they were really trying to take some Christian teaching and seeding the fact that it's not supernatural, or moving away from talk about the Trinity or about heaven or some of these distinctive Christian theologies, or the resurrection even, focusing more on an example of agape love or tolerance or things like that, because they're trying to carve out some space for Christian teaching in the modern world.
Mm-hmm. And kind of part and parcel with that was his critique of apologetics and theodicy. Apologetics being this kind of attempt to meet the rational explanation for God at the level of this kind of reductionistic rationalism, for lack of better terms. And then theodicy, as I understand it, Drew, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's kind of Christians' attempt to deal with the problem of evil, to explain away how can a God who is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent allow for evil in the world and pain and suffering. And so this more apologetic approach that discards the mystery that is evident in the scriptures and stands humbly underneath the transcendental, the transcendence of God that is outside of human explanation. And how do we hold those in tension? Applying our powers of observation to that which is immanent, but recognizing the limits of human capacity and human reason to discern the totality of the nature of God and the reality in which we live.
Yeah, I'd say his critique of apologetics, I want to be careful on this one. It depends on what you mean by the word apologetics. I think if we view apologetics as answering the objections posed to us by a secular culture and potentially offering our own challenges. I mean, we do that on this podcast. I would argue that both Taylor and Smith are doing that in some way. Mm-hmm. So apologetics understood that way versus apologetics understood that I can, using human reason, prove God's existence to you, which I think they would both be pretty critical of, and I think for good reason, in the sense of the danger of that approach is that you are allowing a certain ontological or epistemological system to define our belief in God. So if I can prove this, or if I can use science to prove this element of what I see in Scripture or something like that, that then becomes the foundation of faith. And so two different ways of doing apologetics, and what he's highlighting is be careful if your approach is allowing modernity or postmodernity to set the parameters of the game, so to speak. Then whatever you do, you're actually coming under the tenets of modernity and trying to prove the Christian faith, rather than allowing the Christian faith to be a separate, and we have dialogue between the two, which I think is a much better way of approaching apologetics. Yeah, theodicy is one of the key modern concepts that people wrestle with, and for good reason. It's not going to be resolved. I think his point's a good one. Probably not enough to resolve the debate, but I think what he's trying to say here is that this view of nowhere, which means in philosophy that I'm able to stand outside of my own cultural assumptions and I can see all the factors, and it's this cool analysis of objectively what's going on, that then allows me to make judgments and determinations about something. That has largely been repudiated. Most people don't believe that anymore. I can't escape my own culture. I can't see all the factors. I can't understand. That's human culture I can't even understand, let alone a transcendent God. And so what Smith is telling us here is that it is the fact that we believe we can understand everything then positions us in a seat of judgment over God's intentions of why he might allow something, versus, as you said, Mick, the mystery of a transcendent God and the fact that we can't see outside of our own assumptions causes us to say we just can't understand the reality of evil in the world. It's a fact of life. And he doesn't even get into Christian teaching about sin, for example, of that contribution towards evil. So I think it's a good point that he's making there. Now, on page 55, Smith analyzes Charles Taylor's Hegelianism.
Yeah, and I'm glad you're covering this because, truth be told, I have never really fully understood Hegelian philosophy, and then, I generally understand the concept of a dialectic and thesis and antithesis and synthesis, but the application here was a little dense for me. So unpack it for us.
Well, first of all, he's notoriously difficult to understand, and so you'll see that most people in analyzing him give it the best shot they can give, but with the disclaimer of he's just hard to understand. Second, my longstanding recognition that my German pronunciation is not good, so anytime I am discussing them, feel free to correct me if I'm getting the names wrong. But what in a very simplistic understanding, Hegel has this dialectic where he's taking a thesis and an antithesis, or the antithesis. He's taking those two things, and he's saying you have an idea, and then you kind of have its opposite. And what happens is there is a process of becoming where it's the interaction of those two things generates something new. Now, Hegel had his own theological system that's too complex to get into. It's a form of pantheism where he is viewing this process of becoming. He's actually equating it with the Holy Spirit in the world.
Yeah, I understood him to think of the world as enchanted, which doesn't...
Probably not enchanted, but he's viewing, he is saying essentially what goes on in the world is almost God's own sense of becoming. And that is found, in a different system, but process theology has some of those same ideas. if you could, rather than going there, I don't think that's what we're getting into with Taylor's work, but this thought that there's a thesis, an antithesis, and then you arrive at a synthesis. And so you have the one, you have the other, and then they're pulled together in a whole. So where you can see this play out, I'll just actually take the story we're talking about here. If stage one is the moral, metaphysical, and eschatological vision of Christianity, is the thesis, the antithesis is the naturalism, humanism, and materialism of modernity. And in a way, you could look at those as opposed to each other, but in reality, one was, the second was dependent upon the first. So you don't get the antithesis without the thesis. Then what happens is the synthesis is secularism 3, and it's this nova effect. And so another way of saying that is you can't get where we are today without both of those other two stages contributing to it. So if you don't have the original Christian vision of society and the modern vision of society, then you can't have the society as we have it today, where I have the possibility of believing whatever I want. Mm-hmm. So you can take that. It's like I need to have let's take the moral and eschatological vision of Christianity. You get things like human rights, agape love, a universal understanding of human dignity. We're all part of the same human family. Like all that kind of language that comes from that, even metaphysical, that the world is governed and dictated by the word of God, thus the world is reasonable and can be understood. There's a lot of things that Christianity contributes. Well, then modernity comes along and in some ways is reacting against, but also inspired by the Christian vision. And so
he calls the agape analog.
Yeah, the agape analog. And what he means by that is it is the agape love modeled by Christ stripped away from religious framework. Mm-hmm. And so you have that. You have this vision for a thriving society. You have a world that's discovered or that still can be understood by reason. And you have these concepts that come straight from Christianity, but now they're markedly different. They're no longer religious. And in fact, for the people that maybe were advancing some of these, they would have understood themselves as doing something opposite or different, even though it was dependent on the Christian vision. Then the synthesis is neither of those two things. It's something different. And I think that's what he would argue is secularism 3. And he calls it the nova effect. And so I needed all that different material to then allow me to have this concept, or even individualism as a Christian concept. Mm-hmm. It allows me to create this belief system that we have today that is modern secularism, expressive individualism, where there's a very strong moral vision, there's an eschatological vision at one level of the type of society that everyone wants to have. There's the metaphysical system of naturalism and all of that. And so it's not this linear progression, but it's more of a spiral. You have stage one, and then it spirals, and you're kind of, each is dependent on the other to form this synthesis.
Yeah, an interesting application of that. It'd be maybe a discussion for another time. But as you're talking, I'm thinking of modern social justice, for instance, as a synthesis possibly of these various frames of belief where kind of this baseline of human rights or equality, that you don't necessarily arrive at that logically through a purely atheistic frame. Yet, a lot of modern social justice is steeped in more secular assumptions, and you kind of get this mashup, this synthesis of the two. Mm-hmm. I just maybe an analysis for another time, but I'm seeing that as maybe a practical outworking of this idea.
Yeah, or you can maybe say it this way, is that I think modern culture wants what Christianity offered, but within the immanent frame. So we want the benefits of the morals, aesthetic, ethical, eschatological, I could probably keep going, even to some extent metaphysical vision of Christianity, but we don't want to give up the immanent frame of the centrality of the self, or the concept that human knowledge and power is able to make sense and manipulate the world according to our own ends. And so that's the mashup I think that you're talking about there. And really, I see there being another Hegelian, process going on that I don't know is fully drawn out in the book, but I'll just take my own stab at it. If the starting point is, if you picture a never-ending spiral, we're probably at a new stage now where if the starting point is the naturalism, humanism, and materialism of modernity, what that's actually led to is the nova effect. And you can kind of think about where we are today. There's an antithesis at some level of we're reacting against what modernity offered. We don't want this idealistic vision of the world that we can understand it. We're actually swinging hard the other way. Postmodern culture is saying we can't understand the world. The idealism that we can build this incredibly ethical society, culture today has a lot of pessimism about any system that's created, about any institution. We don't have this faith that we're going to create these awesome institutions. We have suspicion towards everything. And at the same time, we're not willing to give up some of that core ethical teaching that derived in Christianity. But there's not a synthesis yet. And I think that's some of the fragility that he's getting at here is secular culture is fragilized because there's a lot of things that people want to have, but they don't have a fully developed religious framework to sustain it. So it makes it difficult because it's, at one level dependent on something else, but the something else that it's dependent on isn't well established. And so it's fragile.
Yeah, this immanentization is kind of buffered by this bent towards the transcendent that humans have innately, and it kind of keeps us in this spiral. I think later on he'll talk about those tensions that create the nova effect, the pull towards both the immanent and the transcendent, among other things. So let's keep moving.
So let's get into what drives this process. And on page 57, there's a quote I want to highlight here that I think is a really good one. He's describing the process of secularism, and he has this quote: "What becomes particularly distasteful," and then he puts in parenthetically, "the word is chosen advisedly, is the notion of God's agency and hence the personhood of God." And then page 58, he says, "Impersonal religion, secularism, is decommunioned, de-ritualized, and disembodied." So let me unpack all this because we're in deep waters here. But I think this is a really key point, is that what is happening in secularism is that there is an element of taste, aesthetic. It's not reason. And what he means by this is that the elite of society have a vision or an understanding or a narrative of the world.
An imaginary.
Yeah, they have a social imaginary that they have started to inhabit. And what fits or what doesn't fit in that is not just a product of reason, but it's a product of taste. And, there are certain things that I just wouldn't do if I was trying to hang out with elite society. If I am trying to fit in with a group of people that are well-versed in the grammar of modern art, I'm probably not going to bring up my Thomas Kincaid collection. You don't, and it's an issue there of, is that a reasonable thing? No. What makes one better than the other? I mean, art's in the eye of the beholder, but it's taste. I recognize that if I were to bring that up in that type of society, that I'm going to stand out as an outlier. So it's not the fact that I've thought it through and I can logically explain to you why modern art is better than Thomas Kincaid. It's the fact that I recognize if I want to fit in with this group, I need to conform to the social taste of this group. And so Taylor's story, he's talking about changing taste. And again, that's that quote, the word is used advisedly, changing taste among the elite that then drives what people are willing to engage and talk about. And his point is that it is not tasteful to elite society, going back, 200 years ago, to consider God having active agency in the world. They're okay with the depersonalized religion. So God as representing the natural functions of the world, God as representing some kind of universal system, that's fine. But God as an active agent who breaks into the world and does stuff is now distasteful. Not that somebody could disprove that, but it's not tasteful to them.
Yeah, and again, that goes back, I think last week we were talking about how, or last episode, most people don't convert on the basis of the actual propositions of the thing they're converting to. Like, people don't become secularized or atheistic after really evaluating the claims of science. And it's it's at the level of this socialization and that kind of subconscious imaginary that happens, that you're describing, that it's no longer tasteful in this specific context. And it's not so much at the level of deep rational thought and reflection.
Yeah, so let me take an example here that I think would bear out. If I could live in one of two places, let's say one of the places was a small town in Tennessee, and the other place was right next to Harvard's campus or Cambridge or something like that. Pick your spot. And if I had the same education level, same IQ, and I went and hung out in some kind of community space where I did not discuss anything intellectual. So it wasn't that I was having intellectual conversations. It wasn't that I was having somebody educate me, but it was purely the aesthetic taste of those two environments. What I am going to find believable is going to change radically simply based off of aesthetics. Because what's motivating me is the desire to conform to some kind of social system. And we as humans are most of us, I should say, are pretty good at picking up on what's appropriate aesthetically. And we dress certain ways, not that we don't have the freedom to dress otherwise, but we just kind of know that how I dress signals the group I want to be a part of. And so we think that way. We do that. I mean, even the music we listen to privately does that. Not just the music I might listen to elsewhere, but I don't listen to Nickelback in secret. It's like there are things like that we signal. We're constantly signaling, and we don't even realize that we're doing it. We're driven by aesthetics, and so I think we would be foolish to think that does not also affect our intellect. That our intellect is also not driven by aesthetic taste. And I've mentioned Pierre Bourdieu many times, but that's his thesis, and he's writing as a Marxist, so he's not a Christian at all, but he's driving home that same point. He's looking at it. And so Taylor, going back into his narrative, is what he's saying is that elite taste during this time period, roughly 200 years ago, is changing, or 300 years ago. And at first, that's happening only in elite circles around university campuses, but then it's being slowly filtered out to the masses. For all of our British friends, I'm now going to say an offensive statement, but there's some research out there that the American English accent is more accurate to what would have been the common British accent of Shakespearean times. And in particular, our R's. I don't say ka, I say car. We pronounce the R. I think the right way to say it is rhoticity or something like that. I'm sure some British person is going to instantly correct me on botching this. But
Rhoticity?
Rhoticity, that's probably the right way of saying it. And the history of this is right around the time the United States was founded, after kind of a lot of the initial British settlers came over, that started a change where in the upper classes of British society, they would drop the pronunciation of the R at the end of words. And what started as something in the elite gradually filtered its way down through the rest of society. Because if I hear the elite rich people or the academic people talking a certain way, I want to incorporate their cadence, their vocabulary, their grammar into my own manner of speaking because I'm socially mobile. Now, at first, the guy on the street, the beggar on the street's not doing that, but the next tier down is doing that. And then the next tier down is doing it. And it just kind of keeps going down the line until eventually what's spoken in society mirrors what was generated among the elite. And, you can look at the trajectory of Australia is different because most of the waves of migration happened after that had already taken place.
Yeah, I can't remember. I was just starting to look up. I can't remember the name of that process, but where an idea that kind of starts in the elite, the time it takes for that to filter out to the masses. There's there's a science behind it. And, a more modern, this is not a great analog with what you're just talking about, but a more modern example would be, how quickly homosexuality was embraced by not just a small academic circle, but how quickly that filtered out into, the whole breadth of Western society. And I'm thinking back to Carl Trueman and The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, and he talks about how the arts have always partnered with academics to help disseminate ideas, and how the Romantics disseminated Enlightenment ideals, and how the Surrealists disseminated existential ideals. And you have an interesting kind of analog that's happening here with these secular ideals.
Yeah, let me build on that for a second, and we'll make this our last point for today, and we'll pick up chapter 3 next time. But if we think about how things change is via aesthetics, we're living within a cultural narrative. It's the aesthetics of our elite, and that then generates a lot of what becomes believable in society. So we're kind of taking Taylor and Smith and we're extrapolating it. It does generate an interesting thought exercise of maybe looking at our world today. So I would say where we are today is less about the aesthetics of logic. And what I mean is, if I could go back in time 100 years ago, the elite society would be these people who tried to be above it all, had this maybe generous outside composure, but they operated according to the rules of logic. They had this sense of how the world operated. Religion was more for the masses who needed it, but they were above that because they had logic and science, and this claim to knowing and understanding the world, this confidence in human reason and ability. There was an aesthetic background to that of how the elite would operate in a society. And then that gets filtered down to eventually, 100, 200 years later, it changes the way that common people understand the world, even at an intellectual level. So where are we today? In our society in the United States, we could probably look to Ivy League campuses, places like the Bay Area, go to Brooklyn, New York, Park Slope, places like that, Manhattan even, and just see how are people acting there? What do they think? What are they looking at? What I would argue is that elite aesthetics today is less about logic or not about logic and a whole lot more about individual human freedom and expression. And so it's prioritizing individual expression, but without compromising capitalism and the free market. And so I think you have this thing where you have people who've really benefited from a certain economic situation and political situation combined with an aesthetic of human liberation, human freedom. And so a lot of what's happening then is I think those two things shape what is tasteful in our society. And it's not that there's not radicals on all sides of the coin, but what governs elite discourse is, I would argue, the convergence of those two things.
And I think that statement has a lot of explanatory power. Just even the first time I've read that or heard you say that, but that really explains a lot of interactions I've had over the past 3 to 5 to 7 years, and I think that's helpful for maybe some of our listeners who you might find yourself on more of like, maybe you're in the conservative South or whatever, and you're kind of looking at what's going on in broader culture, and you're just bewildered. And I think this helps, and not to vilify. I think our position's probably pretty clear on this, but this idea that's the aesthetics of individual human freedom, individual expression, has outstripped the aesthetics of logic. And I think there's something highly redemptive embedded in that, but that is a really important point that would be helpful to reflect upon when engaging in culture and when evaluating how is Western culture impacting me as a follower of Jesus. We talk about the formative process, our spiritual formation, and how we are shaped and formed by broader culture. And this is a really a very potent formula that is in the water that we are swimming in. That I think if we just talk about individual human freedom over and against the surrender that's required of the Christian faith, or we've talked about this ad nauseum, but just in any relationship or in marriage, the need to surrender my individual human freedom. I mean, this is the water that we're swimming in. That's an interesting that doesn't compromise capitalism and the free market. We are motivated, like the motive structures are very evident.
Yeah, and I hope people who have listened to me realize I'm also not a reactionary conservative on stuff like this.
Right.
Like, I don't think the previous synthesis of the aesthetic of logic was any better. So I'm not trying to go back to
cold calculating.
Yeah, I think that was equally corrosive for the Christian faith, and what went before that was bad. And I think anytime we have this, we're always having to say that there are stumbling blocks in culture to Christian teaching. So I do not in any way believe that going back to some kind of previous synthesis that enabled Christians to maintain cultural power without compromising standing with elite society was better. I actually think the modern situation, or the contemporary situation where we are today, maybe is better than what it used to be, because at least now it's more out in the open, and we can't maybe get away with trying to play both sides, which I think Christians have a bad habit of doing. So I am not an apologist for what was. I think that was equally corrosive. Maybe some things that are better, some things that are worse. I think there's some good things about this aesthetic of individual expression. I think there's good things about capitalism.
Totally.
So I'm not. It's not so much a judgment of attacking those things as much as maybe just looking at it. I'll mirror Taylor's phenomenology of try it on and see if it makes sense of the world to you, and especially if you operate in those places, listen for it, because I think that's what governs discourse. Like, I think a great example of this is, why does sexual liberation get so much more attention than poverty? Because if I was thinking about it, if I was actually concerned, my primary concern was those who are most marginalized, the most victimized by society, it's pretty obvious that poverty is the greatest driver of all types of really bad outcomes.
Victimization, yeah.
Yeah, in every single direction. But people give lip service to it. But if you actually look at where the attention goes, where the training goes, where the money goes, it tends to not be towards mitigating real poverty. It goes to a lot of other stuff, more identity politics. And I'm not saying the identity politics is, I think there can be benefit to certain things. Like I'm grateful for the attention on gender disparity or racial disparities. I think that's important. So please no one hear that as a critique. I'm not so much pointing out that we should talk about those things less. I'm just surprised at how little economic poverty gets talked about when it's such an obvious indicator of all types of really bad social justice outcomes, and especially for racial minority groups that have been historically oppressed. And so it's like this very obvious thing that I don't think gets talked about that often because I don't think it fits the aesthetic as much. It's a lot easier for me to talk about other things because I can fit in and use the buzzwords, and I can fit in that society without actually having to make any kind of substantive change. That's just Drew's quick analysis. Yeah, my hot take. Obviously, critique it. It's fair game. It's not my hill to die on. What I would say, though, is I think that all of us should have a very healthy skepticism regarding the values of elite society being imposed upon ordinary masses and attempting to call that social justice. I think where I am most deeply skeptical is that the people who are at the very top of society are the ones dictating the terminology of social justice, rather than those who are most oppressed in society dictating the terms of social justice. I think there's a pretty negative inversion that's happened with that. And as a Christian, what I'm trying to do and be very careful about is I want to be very good at listening to the actual poor and saying, what do you guys need, rather than allowing what goes on at a university campus to dictate my understanding of justice or the needs of the world. And it's this aesthetic thing that throws me off a little bit. So I think if the conversation is real poverty, how do we help people who are in need? Wonderful conversation. If the conversation is how do I conform to the aesthetic taste of people who like to talk about justice issues, I'm a lot more skeptical about that. And so that, that's a nuanced thing. There's balance needed on all sides of it. But maybe more than trying to nail something down with it, it's using that as an example of how aesthetics shapes our understanding of the world and how the aesthetics of an elite society eventually filter down and eventually change culture. And I'm just highlighting one example of how I see that happening.
Yeah, so talking about aesthetics, neither vilifying nor justifying, but calling awareness to, because it's far too complex to just vilify en masse or justify en masse, but to become aware and to be able to discern as followers of Jesus who are trying to apply the way of Jesus in the cultural context that we find ourselves within.
So we'll wrap here. I will say one, just to make all of this practical for us. When we think of the process of change, when we think of the impact of aesthetics, when we think of how things have become more or less believable in a society, for those of us who are followers of Christ, and that's our desire and goal in life, what I think we need to do is be understanding, aware, wise about how those forces impact all of us. And going back to some of the things, it's not what we have thought through and believe, it's what we're not thinking through and accepting. And so as a Christian, I am absorbing all of these things. I am being influenced by the aesthetic taste of an elite society. I am absorbing the social imaginary of our culture. The synthesis is affecting me, and I'm wanting to resolve it in my own ideas. All that kind of stuff, this is happening within me. And so what I appreciate about this book is it gives me some language to identify and even name some of those things. And I think that the challenge of culture is, as a Christian, I don't just demonize culture. There's a lot of good in culture, and including all the stuff I've just talked about, stuff that are being taught from university campuses. I know that a lot of people who listen, probably a lot of them are very skeptical, and I am too, but I also, I want to challenge. There's some good stuff there too, and good people. And there's stuff that I would disagree with, and I think, like you said, it's just super nuanced, super complicated. No way in a podcast that we can sift through all that. Even, I always hesitate on throwing out the examples. Hopefully that's not a stumbling block for somebody, but I'm just trying to generate thought process rather than say I or anyone else am capable of just nailing that all down. But the point I want to make with all of this is sometimes we need to take a step back and figure out what's impacting us, what's affecting us, what's forming us, and how are changes in society affecting me, and where might I be unconsciously following along, even if I'm arguing against it. I think that's the apologetics example from earlier. I'm arguing against something while at the same time accepting it and not aware of that process. And
by conceding the starting point.
I'm conceding the starting point, so I'm accepting it while I'm arguing against it. And I think that happens a lot with how we engage culture right now, is we're conceding starting points and then arguing and attacking. Rather than saying, like, is the goal of life freedom of expression? There is some beauty to that I think is good. But as a Christian, I can't go there all the way, because the call of Jesus is I take up my cross and die. So it's actually not my freedom of expression that's the starting point. It's me surrendering my life to Christ and participating in his Spirit, where there is some individual element to that, but there's also a surrender and there's a transformation that takes place.
Or ceding the starting point that reason is the only way to talk about the transcendent, but the entire other branch of epistemology of revelation being left out of the conversation.
Or the huge one that assuming the world does not have God active in the world. Like that's my starting point, is I believe God is an active, I maybe hesitate to use the word agent for some complex theological reasons, but if I can use that word as an analog, God is a personal, active agent in the world who's present everywhere at all times, and he's moving and doing things and leading and guiding, and I'm not willing to cede that point. I'm not willing to cede the point that I only find the fullness of who I am in a participation in the life of God, which is only made possible through Christ, through my death to self, life in him, joining him in the cross and the resurrection, the fullness and the filling of the Holy Spirit, and that this life only ultimately makes sense and finds its purpose in the eschaton as I am renewed as a new creation. It's like I'm not going to cede any of those points. And I'm not going to cede the point that whatever the world says, as Christians, we do have a call to love our neighbor as ourselves, to love our enemies, to care for the poor, to care for the oppressed, to fight for the needs of others, all those different things. So the more I'm unwilling to cede those points and I'm immersing myself in the Christian story and the Christian narrative, it gives me resources then to dialogue with secularism, but also not get swept up in it. And I think all of us face the danger of getting swept up.
It's a good place to stop. I think at the beginning of the episode, we said we'd cover chapters 2 and 3. We only got through chapter 2, so we bought you an extra week. If you're following this in real time and you're behind on the reading, we will talk about chapter 3 in the next episode and keep plowing through How Not to Be Secular by James K.A. Smith. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time on Ideology.